Yeah. Hello there.
Hello.
Jeff,
Yeah.
do you have your key to the shed?
Yeah.
I walked into my backpack. I locked.
Okay, I don't know. Let's see. So some people show up.
Yeah, I think my grandma is coming. She was really interested in it, and I was like, okay, yeah, you can come.
That's great.
Yeah. Is he also joining early, or is he coming like at 12?
We asked him to come about 10 minutes early. We'll see. Here comes,
Okay.
okay, Kimberly. Okay. 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 Mhm. So this is Kimberly, one of the people that's joined is the chair of our board. So
I don't know what they're doing.
welcome her. Here comes Professor Miller. Great. Welcome, Professor Miller.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Feinberg. How have you been?
Very well. Thank you for doing this. Really appreciate it.
Happy to do it. Happy to
Yeah.
do it.
So, you can see Daisy Barner is interning with us. She's a student at Cornell, and she's going to be she and I will be interviewing you.
Okay, fantastic. Very good to meet you.
Yeah, and so she had to read your book to do this. So anyway, so she's done some nice work for us. And so we're very happy to have her involved this semester.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you for reading the book. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a really good read. So it wasn't too bad. Like once I got into it, it went really quick. So
Okay. Oh, good. Okay, well, that makes me happy. I'm glad to know that. What are you taking up at Cornell? What are you studying?
I'm a psych major, but
Oh.
I'm hopefully pre-law.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you know my dear friends? I have two dear friends there. One is Professor Anthony Burrow, and one is Professor Anthony Ong. Both are psychologists, both in human development.
Oh, they're in HD. I don't think I've taken as many HD classes.
Okay.
But I do know Anna Haskins, and
Yeah.
I think I've seen y'all in a few interviews together. So I
Yeah.
thought that was pretty
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah. Professor Haskins is a beautiful person. She's just wonderful. She was wonderful. Fantastic.
Welcome, everyone, to Interfaith Action for Human Rights interview with Professor Rueben Jonathan Miller, who has written a wonderful book called Halfway Home. And this is the book we'll be asking questions about. My name is Charles Feinberg. I'm the Executive Director of Interfaith Action for Human Rights. We're a group of people of faith from Maryland, the District, and Virginia. And our mission is to change how we incarcerate people and change incarceration from focusing on punishment to more on rehabilitation and healing. We do advocacy, and so we write legislation, try to find sponsors in state legislatures and here in the district. Our major focus has been on ending the abuse of solitary confinement or prolonged isolation over the last 5 years. We do education, such as programs like these. We also have a pen pal project in which we write to DC residents and others from other states who are in the Federal Bureau of Prisons and who are scattered throughout the country. So we have over close to 250 pen pals writing to people in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And we also involved in engaging law firms to do pro bono work for people in the inside, where we feel that their allegations of abuse, of human rights violations are serious enough that they demand legal intervention. So those are some of the 4 areas that we're involved in. I was originally a congregational rabbi for 42 years, and I've been the executive director now for Interfaith Action for the last 6 years. And it's my pleasure to turn over to Daisy Barner, who has been a student intern for us, and she's a student at Cornell. Daisy, I'd like to introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. As mentioned, I am Ciasia, and I'm a junior psychology major at Cornell. And I've had the opportunity to intern with Interfaith Action for Human Rights since mid-February. So it's been a really great time so far, and I've really enjoyed working with the organization.
Great. So let me just say a few words about the author we're interviewing. Rueben Jonathan Miller is an assistant professor at the University of Chicago Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy and Practice. And his research examines life at the intersections of race, poverty, crime control, and social welfare policy. His new book is Halfway Home, which I showed before. And that book is based on 15 years of research and practice with currently and formerly incarcerated men, women, their families, partners, and friends. And Dr. Miller has conducted fieldwork in Chicago, Detroit, and New York City. He has examined how law, policy, and emergent practices of state and third-party supervision change the contours of citizenship, activism, community, and family life for poor Black Americans and the urban poor more broadly. Dr. Miller received his PhD from Loyola University in Chicago, a master's degree from the University of Chicago, and a bachelor's degree from Chicago State University. To fill out this short biographical picture, we should note that Professor Miller served as a prison chaplain for 4 or 5 years, and his life work and certainly his recently published book, Halfway Home, have been influenced by the fact that family members have been incarcerated as well. So I'll turn it over. Daisy is going to ask the first question.
All right, Professor Miller, just to get us started, could you walk us through where you grew up? What was it like growing up there?
Yeah, I grew up in Chicago, on the South Side. I'm from the South Side of Chicago, and I grew up in a pretty much an all-Black neighborhood, a mostly Black neighborhood, on what we would call Chicago's low end. It's a working class neighborhood, where it's a working class neighborhood, where families sort of pooled their money to make sure that their kids were safe. They did the best that they could. But like most neighborhoods in Chicago, Chicago is a city of neighborhoods. Like most neighborhoods in Chicago, if you go outside 3 or 4 blocks, as kids do when you wander, then there are all the dangers apparent of living in a big city, in any big city. And so those dangers were from without and from within. I mean, so when I grew up in the 1980s and 1990s, when I was a teenager, this was on the cusp of many things. You know, in Chicago, the murder rate was particularly high that year. There was a star basketball player, Benji Wilson, who was murdered. But there was also police abuse, rampant police abuse at the time. And so we all knew of folks who would be grabbed off the street and taken to a neighborhood not far from my neighborhood. This neighborhood was Bridgeport. This was a predominantly white neighborhood that was known to be a white racist and awful neighborhood when I grew up. In fact, when my brothers and I would wander a few blocks from our home into the Bridgeport neighborhood, that often be rocks thrown at us. This was in the late 80s, early 90s, by kids in Bridgeport. And so what the police would do is they'd pick kids up and they drop them off in the middle of Bridgeport. And so much of this became a game where the kids learned how to run through Bridgeport and make it home, or learn how to run from police when they saw them. And so anyway, I grew up in a neighborhood like many Black people who were born poor in this country, who live in residentially segregated neighborhoods, where there are dangers. There's also joys and pleasures and beauty and love and family. I was raised by my grandmother, who loved us dearly. And so in short, the neighborhood was complicated, full of beauty and full of promise and full of potential. But it was also, full of the kinds of dangers that Black people learn to live with in this country every day.
So both your brother and father were incarcerated, is that correct? Yeah. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about circumstances that led to their incarceration, and what you learned from their experiences, and how their incarceration impacted your life.
Sure. So my father didn't know well at all. My grandmother raised me. My grandmother was a strong, beautiful, and wonderful woman who migrated from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, during the second wave of the Great Migration, and cast roots in Chicago. She married my grandfather. Her name was Dorothy Jean. His name was Tommy, and they took in the children of their daughter. And so my mother had struggles, and so we were in foster care, and she came and got us out of foster care. So I didn't really know my father growing up, and I didn't know my mother so well. I mean, I knew her. I mean, I would see her when she was visiting, stuff like that. But the person who raised me was my grandmother.
You're muted for some reason, not sure why.
Okay,
Oh,
there we go. All right. I didn't really meet my father face to face until I was in my mid to late 20s. And this is in the book. And I had already started doing work as a volunteer chaplain in the Cook County Jail. That was motivated by an ethical impulse that I'm happy to talk about. And I met my father and learned at that point, I was in my late 20s, that he had been locked up for 20 years. And then I wouldn't see him again. I never saw him again. I'd hear from him late last year when I learned that he died. He had died in August. I heard in around January, February, while I was finishing writing the book. My brother started getting in trouble very early, and we were foster kids, and this is why this is relevant. So it wasn't just rambling, but so he got in trouble very early. He got in trouble for fighting, for smoking weed, for doing things that kids do, doing things that some kids do, I should say, because there are kids who don't do that, I guess. Every kid I know fights, but but some kids maybe didn't smoke weed. I don't know too many kids who didn't try things when they were kids, but he got in trouble, and because we were foster kids, the super knew. And because we were already, quote, wards of the court, and this is an important designation, The super knew that our connection to that home that my grandmother and my grandfather had saved to buy, and it wasn't a home, it was an apartment, but that they scraped their money together to be able to rent up until my grandfather died in the 1980s. My grandmother, with his pension and with the height of her income at $8 an hour as a secretary at a large hospital in the city. So they worked very hard to live in this neighborhood, this working class neighborhood where they thought their children could be safe. And the super, we won't call it supers in Chicago, you know, call them building managers or janitors, but the person who ran the building knew this. And so my brother got into a fight, broke a kid's window, and the janitor, the super, the building manager knocks on our door with a police officer and an ultimatum. Either my brother leaves, meaning goes to a group home, what I consider his first kind of incarceration, or we're evicted. We'd be evicted. And so my grandmother made the very hard decision to send my brother back into foster care, into group homes. And from there, the story is predictable because we know what happens with foster kids in this country. We know that most don't graduate high school if they age out of foster care. We know that many have legal entanglements in states like Michigan and Illinois. Up to 35-40% of kids who age out of foster care end up being arrested at some point in their lifetime. We know that they struggle in the labor market because of the way our systems of care operate, because of the way that they're marked very early on, the kinds of attention that adults pay to these children once they know that they're so-called bad children is very different. So he got in trouble and he stayed in trouble. While I was writing the book, he was arrested and went to prison. And so I write about what it's like to care for him while I follow families who are caring for their loved ones who are also in jails and prisons.
So, given that you described going to prison as such a norm or like a common occurrence in Black culture, what happened that made you begin diving in and questioning why this has become the status quo?
I appreciate this question. I don't know that going to prison is a norm in Black culture. I think being arrested is, for sure. And so the research shows that something like a third of Black boys who graduate high school will be arrested, will spend some time in an American jail or prison. There's some distinctions between those two things, and I think that they're necessary to maintain. So, you might go to jail you get arrested, you go to jail, you're held in a jail. Most people who go to jail, their charges are dropped. Like most people, like 2/3 or something like that. Like some egregious number of people who go to jail never are charged with any crime at all. But having said that, they've spent a few hours to a few years in an American jail cell. No charges. Think Khalif Browder for a hot second. No charges. Charges eventually drop. 3 years in prison. The crime, perhaps stealing a book bag. Perhaps. So the jail is this disruptive force that holds people that we're not quite sure whether or not they did something, but we're going to hold you because we think you may have done something. But anyway, that's a normal experience in the lives of Black people. Being stopped by police is a normal experience in the lives of Black people. What's interesting is it's also a normal experience now in this age in the lives of white people. While about a third of Black men will go to a jail or prison in their lifetime, while 49% of Black men will be arrested before they turn 23, 38% of white men, and actually white boys, and I mean boys, because they will be arrested before they turn 23 years old in this country. We've known that for about half a decade. And so we've built a system in which we're locking up millions of people each year, millions of people. But to get to your point, I appreciate this. It's a wonderful question. I just wanted to make the distinction between jails and prisons and talk about the difference between like the arrest and going to prison. Once you go to prison, you've been convicted of something. Most people who go to jail, charges are dropped. Charges are never filed. If they are filed, they're considered minor things. Most people are in jail for misdemeanor offenses, or they're in jail on their way, say, to a jail or prison. But but the routine nature of arrest and incarceration of some kind, group homes, Job Corps, I think we should count those, American jails, etc., is a normal occurrence in the lives of poor Black people. So much so that I didn't notice for many years, that I didn't pay attention for many, many years. And it was an ethical commitment to the prisoner that drew me into the work. So I'm a religious guy, you know, I was a Christian growing up, am still religious, quite so. And there was a scripture that I encountered, Matthew 25, you know, when I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was naked, did you clothe me? When I was sick and in prison, did you visit me? So says that scripture. And the sick and in prison in the version I read was together, and that was strong to me. It spoke to me deeply. And I asked my pastor if we had a ministry to visit people in prisons, and we didn't. And so she told me to start one. And so I went off and started one. I connected with a parachurch organization called Chaplains for Christ. And we began, and I began what was a 5-year journey, following people into spending time with people in jails, prisons, and detention centers across the country. But when I got there, I was confronted by the gross racial disparities that we see in the American criminal justice system. In my city, in the city of Chicago, something like 80% of the residents of the Cook County Jail are Black, but only about a third of the city is Black. I mean, we were almost evenly split. My city was, you know, 30% Black, 30% Latinx, 30% white. Now there's slightly more Latinx folks than Black people, and there's still just a few more white folks than Black folks in the city. But yeah, still the jail remains about 80% Black. And I was confronted by these long lines of people who were moving through the hallways. And I wanted to be a better chaplain. And so that led me to social work school. I wanted to learn some clinical skills. That's what I wanted to do with my life. But my interest changed. The more time I spent reading, the more time I spent studying what mass incarceration was, what its origins was, what it meant at the local level, how it showed up in people's families, the more I wanted to know. And so I studied sociology. I went to school to get a PhD in sociology to study punishment. So it was really an ethical impulse that brought me to it. And it was an intellectual curiosity that kept me in it. But what was striking was that while I was conducting this research, I learned about my brother going to prison. My brother goes to prison while I'm a chaplain, while I'm doing work, while I'm doing research. So it wasn't that they were involved first and that drew me to the field. It was that I was in the field because of an ethical commitment, because of an intellectual curiosity. And then I get confronted with mass incarceration in a real way, largely because you can't avoid it in this country. If you're born poor and Black after a certain period in time. I was born in 1976. Post 1972, when we engage in this long experiment of incarceration, when we arrest more people each year at a greater rate each year for 27 straight years, the largest experiment in human caging in the history of the contemporary Western world. When we embarked on that, if you were born poor and Black in this country, you couldn't have avoided it if you tried. And so that's kind of how we get to the place of this book, this research, this work, why I started to pay attention in a much deeper way than I had before. I should say also, I'm taking too long to answer these questions, but I'll answer a bit more briefly in a second. But I should say that while I was a chaplain, I kept seeing people from my neighborhood moving in and out of these places. I'd see people at the store. I'd see their children who they'd send me to visit from time to time. They say, go sit with my mom, go sit with my brother, go sit with my cousin. And I'd do that and I'd see them out and about.
Wow.
We really appreciate your answer. It's definitely not too long. It's so much you can say on these questions and on these matters, and we appreciate all of it. Going now into kind of a main kind of central theme of the book was that most people think of time in prison as like a linear process that starts when someone is convicted and ends when they're released. And your book describes a different process that extends before the crime is even committed and far after a sentence is completed. Can you talk about why that is?
Yeah, I think there's a presumption of guilt that's dropped on Black families in striking and remarkable ways. There's a chapter in the book called Guilt. And the book is about the production of what I call Black guilt. not the book, but the chapter is about the production of what I call Black guilt. But anyway, long story short is that the social science research is quite clear. Black children are seen as more guilty and older than their white counterparts. We know that when people know, for example, when they learn, we think that there's a knowledge process that's necessary to keep people from, say, over arresting folks, because people get arrested for things they do, for sure. And people also get arrested for nothing. So my guys started getting arrested at 12, 13, 10, 11, 14 years old. And they got arrested for all sorts of things. Some guys got arrested for standing around. So in Chicago, they pass all these ordinances around mob action because it's the gang scare. The worry about in New York or places like that, they talk about the youth wilding, this idea of the marauding, fatherless children who go run about the urban landscape causing trouble. We know this famously from the Central Park Five, like all these discussions or the Exonerated Five, all these discussions of wildings and these teenagers left to their own devices. In fact, those scares started in the late 60s and 70s. If we think about thinking about the famous Kubrick film, which I can't remember the name of, but it's about this kind of the idea that these marauding kids for whom rehabilitation won't work, it won't take hold. And these fears and these panics around rehabilitation, for example, not working, especially not for these kids that we start seeing around in the 1970s. We see the retreat from rehabilitation, which is why the work of the Interfaith Council is so very important. We see a retreat from rehabilitation, a retreat from the belief that people can change if given the chance. And we also see an overemphasis on incarcerating people before they're given a chance. So anyway, getting back to the point, my guys are getting arrested 10, 11, 12 years old. The women who I followed were getting arrested 14, 15, 16 years old. And by the time they go to jail or prison, they'd have 10 arrests, and they'd be 10 arrests for nothing. One brother who was in my study, a man I named Martin in the book, was running from abuse. He was running from an abusive home. He was running from a series of abuses that happened to him in his neighborhood. He ended up being homeless. And during his stint of homelessness, he used to sleep. He grew up in a different time. He grew up in a different Chicago. He grew up in Chicago of the 1960s. He was a paper boy. This was the meat packing plant Chicago. This was an industrial Chicago. And so what he used to do is he's a paper delivery boy, and he used to sleep in the newspaper stacks with two other homeless boys that were running from their traumas, running from abuse in their homes, running from abuse on the outside, where police officers would fail to protect these children, even when these children reported crimes that happened against them. But anyway, while he was running and sleeping in the newspaper stack with these little boys, these two little boys, one of the boys who was living with them effectively outside of this newspaper agency was murdered. And so Martin at a young age took to drinking, and Martin at a young age took to drugs, and Martin at a young age, with no adult responding to his needs, of course, with no one there to help him through, no minister, no social service agency to come see about the little boy who had no one to turn to. He's homeless for a decade. And while he's homeless for a decade, the police start to arrest him. They arrest him for trespassing 14 times. Martin's turned to drinking. Martin's turned to drugs. It makes complete sense if he faced the abuse and trauma that he's faced. And he's arrested for the last time for having 3 crack rocks in his pocket. 3 crack rocks. The prosecutor says, I was at the hearing. The prosecutor says, I'm going to try him for a felony. The felony is for possession with intent to distribute. The judge says, that's excessive. The judge says this. The prosecutor says, but Your Honor, he has a pattern of criminality. Look, he's been arrested 14 times, starting when he was a little boy. 14 times for standing around, 14 times for doing nothing. And the social science research tells us that our boys, Black boys, are viewed as older, 4 years on average, and more dangerous. This is why when the police officer Timothy Loman murdered Tamir Rice, the report the police union reported that Timothy Rice wasn't a boy. They called him the male. That's what they called him. Timothy, 12 years old. Tamir Rice, 12 years old. So what we see is a failure to recognize the needs of our children, beginning very early on because of a presumption of guilt that follows Black people, especially in this country, but also an embrace of punishment that goes before them in every interaction. It's interesting. Studies of children in school. There was a social scientific study, a social psychology study that tracked the eye movement of teachers. And the teachers were to look at 4 children, a Black boy, a white boy, a Black girl, and a white girl. And the teacher was told to look out for patterns of deviant behavior, look out for deviance. And they tracked the eye movement of the teacher. Now, the teacher's told to look for deviance, told to look for disruption, told to look for a problem. Who does the teacher look at? The teacher looks at the Black boy, then that Black girl. Eyes constantly focused on those children. Guess what never happened? Any deviant act in that recording, though the teachers logged acts of deviance, though no deviant behavior happened. Because they were primed to look for these things, you see. They were told, they believed they should be looking for these things. And this is the guilt that we see, the presumption of guilt. Long before, I say this in the book, long before the people who I follow encounter the laws of God or man in any meaningful way.
I worked as a contract chaplain in prisons at different times in my career in Wisconsin, then here in the area in Maryland. So I was wondering if you could talk more about how that experience influenced you, and especially what kind of experience, our organization is very committed to ending solitary confinement, being defined as keeping someone in a cell from 22 to 23 hours a day, and for 15 consecutive days. The United Nations has defined anything longer than as an act of torture. So I was wondering if you see how much you saw that. And in my experience, I've heard, for instance, the director of corrections in the state of Virginia say to a whole group of us that solitary confinement is the basic way we maintain security in a prison. So I was just wondering if you could comment on that, how you view that, and whether indeed it does need to be used so much as it is.
I think it doesn't need to be used much or at all. I think I can see justification. I can see the justifications. We put people in high security. We hold people in high security cells to protect them from, say, other prisoners or something like that. If it's a celebrity or something like that. Like I see and hear these justifications, and I still don't find them reasonable. To use solitary confinement as punishment within punishment to ensure the kind of prison order. What I've seen. So as a chaplain, I spent time working in protective custody, and so it wasn't called solitary confinement; it was called protective custody. But what it was men in a box for 23 hours a day, and this was supposedly for their own good, and they would spend their entire time in and under protective custody. As a researcher visiting a prison, I saw wardens, really smart ones, responding to the negative effects of solitary confinement in interesting, informal ways. One warden in one state, and I'm being very careful because I didn't have IRB permission to do this. I was invited by this warden to come to tour solitary confinement, but it wasn't. We have an internal review board, and it was just an invitation. It wasn't a part of my formal research, so I'm being very careful. But one warden in one state invited me to tour. He was very proud of his interventions, and what he did was he trained. This was in a women's prison, and he trained women to effectively be mental health technicians, women prisoners to be mental health technicians. And he gave them a workbook and 2 or 3 weeks worth of training, and they would be monitors for people in solitary confinement, because they knew. And what they would do is they would sit outside the door. They would sit in a seat in shifts outside the door of the women who were in solitary confinement, because the warden knew that the women who were in solitary confinement were subject to mental health breaks, all the problems that this form of torture. This is a tacit admission that it is torture, because he's sitting someone outside the room to intervene at the moment in which the pressure from being alone for 23 hours a day gets to the women and indeed breaks them. And so they'd be trained in techniques to help de-escalate crises, as it were. And these are prisoners. This was a job in this prison, to monitor, to sit in a folding chair outside of a box that a woman was in, with the little slot and no windows, for hours and hours at a time, as additional punishment inside the punishment that she's already been given through the formal sentence. I think it's a barbaric practice. We have many barbaric practices. I think it's morally and ethically wrong, but I think what we need to do is consider, it's something that your organization is doing. It's considering, your association is considering prisoners as people, taking that seriously, believing it. Mm-hmm. They may have been people who've caused harm, but they're people, and as fully human participants in a human community, deserve a place in the world, deserve protections, deserve care. I think this is a place where we have to start from.
We're in another few minutes. We have a couple more questions to ask, and then we're going to open up to questions from our audience. So if you people, I see a number of people made comments, but I appreciate some questions that we could then ask Professor Miller. So we could put those questions in the chat in the next few minutes, and then we'll convey them to Professor Miller. Okay. Daisy, I think you have the next question. Yeah.
All right, so throughout the book, you often mention a stark difference between the Black communities and the people tasked with assisting them, like whether it's in the case of people who live in all Black neighborhoods where the police and firemen are white, or if it were the actual Black people in prison where the guards are majority white, or the jury that's sentencing them. So I was wondering if you can talk about what's the impact of this, and if it's possible for that to be remedied.
It is possible for that to be remedied. Thank you for that question. It is absolutely possible for that to be remedied. Representation matters, but only to an extent. So it's interesting. My dear friend John Eason, I don't mean only to an extent. Okay, so representation really matters. We need to change representation, but I would not be surprised if we change representation and don't see a wholesale transformation of all the practices that we're hoping to end, for example. And the reason why I say this is because we know that about a third of corrections officers, this comes from my dear friend John Eason's research, who wrote a beautiful book called Big House on the Prairie, which is about prison siting. So under what conditions do towns get prisons, you know? But John Eason's work tells us that, you know, many prison guards, up to a third, are people of color. We know from paying attention to many of the headlines, for example, on police killings. You know, very few places that allow for the systematic data collection on police killings because they're underreported, because government agencies, there's no centralized government agency that tabulates these kinds of things. And there are organizations that are, and researchers who have been looking for real, useful, and reliable data. And the best people have been able to do, I think, is scrape the web for reports of police killing. So, you know, the things that we've learned, for example, that tell us, for example, that, you know, 1 in 1,000 Black men will be killed by the police, that police murder is a leading cause of death for Black people in this country, for example. Like this kinds of research is necessarily underreported, because the best we're able to capture are the reports that make their way into the media, you know? Well, anyway, we know from those same reports, we know from those same headlines and studies that many of the people who kill people during a police encounter are Black and Latinx police officers. That happens quite a bit, you know. So there's a problem with representation. This really matters when we think about things like jury selection. But one question is, what do we mean by representation? So if you think about jury selection, we know that people with criminal records in over 30 states in this country can't sit on juries, which means somebody with a criminal record never goes before a jury of their peers. There's nobody on the other side of that box, in that jury box, that knows anything about their experience, or maybe they know something tangentially, but they don't know from their flesh, you know, what it means to spend time in a cage. And so advocates across the country have been trying to work on representation on that front to try to make sure that people who have criminal records, people who've been arrested, incarcerated, been through the system, are able, for example, to sit on jury pools in states that don't allow that. So that's important representation too. And I think shifts in representation, we know that having, for example, a Black juror or a woman in a jury pool increases the likelihood that the person who's being charged with the crime is acquitted. You know, like we know that from the research that the deliberation looks better. I think that changing representation matters, but I think if we want the changes that we hope for example, an end to solitary confinement as a practice in our country, the end to the death by prison of children in this country, life without parole for kids. We got to go a little further than representation, because representation takes us only as far as the imagination of the officer, the imagination of the person in the jury box. You see what I'm saying? So it's like representation matters, but there's a real cultural question about why we rely on punishment to begin with, to address the problems that we're seeking to address. Why more punishment instead of less, to meet all different kinds of behavior. I was asked by Professor Abigail Henson from ASU in an interview that we did together, a question about what it means for us to use the prison itself as the answer to every manner of crime, let alone every manner of social problem. So for every crime, from stealing a car radio to murdering children, you know, or abusing them in different ways, we send people to prison. It's a one size fits all because it comes from our impulse to punish. This is the way we've agreed to punish. This is what we think is the right response to all the problems in the social world. This is why we send police to a mental health crisis. This is why we send police to evict someone when we put them out of an apartment. It is the criminal justice system, the legal system, is our response to behavior we don't like. And it's why we don't have any room, I think, in our hearts for people who've caused harm. And so the changing representation really does matter. And we can change that by looking at the representation, by pushing for, allowing for different kinds of representation, by making sure jury pools are diverse, making sure police officers are diverse, making sure. And that will reduce harm. And at least the research shows a little bit. And we want to take everything we can get. we want whatever we can get. It'll reduce harm a little. It'll reduce a little harm. But if we want to see the fundamental transformation of this thing, then we have to change the way people think and feel about people who've caused harm. You know, one of the tricks of American racism is that we've learned, because of racial disparity, we've learned to ignore the prison. We've got disdain for Black people in this country. And we've done such great work with conflating Blackness with criminality that we've decided to ignore our system of punishment altogether. That happens over there in the corner, with the exception of sort of well-meaning people. So much so that when we talk about criminal justice reform, we talk about this as a benefit for the Black community. If you remember, President Trump talked about giving the Blacks criminal justice reform. Right, the great victory for racial justice is criminal justice reform, because we've conflated Blackness with criminality. And And Black people are overrepresented in the criminal justice system. We know this. 5 times more likely to be arrested, to be incarcerated, twice as likely to be arrested. They do more time, 10% on average longer sentences for Black people that commit crimes in the state penitentiary, 20% longer in the federal for the same crime committed by white people. These are things that we know. It's absolutely right. The disparity is egregious. The disparity is egregious. But our commitment to punishment is murderous. There are 890,000 or so, 900,000 or so Black prisoners in the American jail or prison today. There are 800,000 or 900,000 white prisoners in an American jail or prison today. If we let every Black person out of an American jail or prison today, we still have one of the largest prisons in the world. But we pay no attention to it because we hate Black people. This is how racism works, you see. Right? It fools us into believing that mass incarceration stops at the threshold of the Black family. It fooled us into believing that slavery was about Black people and only hurt Black people. It fooled us into believing that the Jim Crow South, residential segregation and discrimination only hurt Black people. Our disdain for Black people fools us into believing the systems that we enact to confine, define, and control them stops at the threshold of their homes, but it doesn't. It can't. It never has. Slavery cost white people in this country and every person in this country. Residential segregation cost every person in this country. We see that in our failure to deal with public schooling in any reasonable way, for example. In the kind of social safety net we didn't invent to spite poor Blacks because of how we feel about government expenditure on Black folks in this country. We see how much everybody loses in this country. Now is the time to pay attention to what everybody has lost when we think about mass incarceration. Again, disparity is egregious, but the system of punishment itself is murderous. 1 in 2 Black women has a currently incarcerated loved one. It's about 44%. So does 1 in 8 white women in this country. 1 in 8 white women has a currently incarcerated loved one. This is a giant American problem, and it speaks to a spiritual, a moral, and an ethical condition that our country has to wrestle with as a country.
Really powerful words. I'd like now to share a few questions from our audience. Here's one, so just a little shifting here. How were you received as a Black researcher? Was there a presumption that you were not objective or that you were biased?
Yeah, I take there's a thank you for that question. There's in the book I write about the method, and there's an appendix that I call the gift of proximity, where I try to take on the idea of bias, how people think about things. And so to answer the question directly, as a Black researcher, I have not, the bias doesn't, I don't think the bias that's expressed to me comes, the presumption of bias that's expressed to me comes from people presuming that as a Black researcher, I'll think about this or that and this or that way. I mean, I'm sure somebody feels that way, but that's not what's sort of expressed to me, and that's certainly not how it's received in the scientific community and in public policy circles, or when I've given sort of more public addresses or something like that. That's not the bias that shows up. The bias that shows up mostly, the bias that's mostly on people's minds, is the fact that I have a brother who's been incarcerated, and I write about that forcefully, openly, about how it feels, how I experienced it while I was doing my work. And this is important, certainly for me as a social scientist, because objectivity is really the coin of the realm. But I make an argument that there are things that you learn by keeping distant from an issue, and there are things that you learn by getting close. You all, through your commitments to people we've thrown away, have determined to get close, which means you see things other people don't see. And so what I've argued is that what I found scientifically outweighs the limitations, I hope, of the work. I mean, that's kind of apples for oranges, right? Like limitations versus what you find, like the benefit versus, but I think that the benefit of approaching this question openly in the ways that I have has availed things to me that my colleagues have not written about, or maybe perhaps didn't see when they were spending time. There are a couple giant ideas in the book that come from understanding something about what it's like to live under a certain set of conditions. For example, I write about the proliferation of guilt, and I use history throughout to understand how and why people experience social policy change in the ways that they do. And there's a couple concepts that I talk about. An economy of favors that's usually reserved for thinking about authoritarian regimes, but I talk about what it means to be the subject of a favor. And the advent of what I call a supervised society that catalogs the 45,000 laws, policies, and administrative sanctions that target people with criminal records. So there are new things that I bring to bear through my science and through my proximity toward or to the subjects that I study. Being born poor and Black also helps. It's something I reckon with in the book. The things that I've experienced that I know from my flesh that help me not only connect with the people that I'm following, but it leads me to new and different kinds of questions. And I make an argument at the end of the book for the people who read it to get in touch with the parts of themselves that have experienced pain or suffering, but that have also experienced great joy, and to use those experiences not to understand from the skin of someone else. It's impossible. But to walk alongside others and use one's own experiences to help relate to others. It's something that good counselors do all the time. It's something that good servants, good friends too, I think about during funerals, during deaths, where friends come and sit with the people they love and care for. And they don't try to tell them about what it's like for them because they can't know, but they can be with them, and they can be with them in their own skin from their own positions, having had their own sets of experiences. And that's what I advocate for, and so far it's resonated well. But I think they're gonna be people who don't appreciate the approach, and I can appreciate that, and I can take criticism.
Another question, one of the chaplains in our group, he says, chaplains in prison see the evils of solitary confinement, but they're somewhat under a gag order and risk their employment if they say anything. What would you say to these chaplains?
It's such a tough situation to be in because people need you to visit. They need you. Chaplains are kind of an eye into the world, into a world that that's been hidden intentionally. Some chaplains are going to have to take risks, and some chaplains are going to have to stay in that prison and do that beautiful work. Mm-hmm. But all of them can talk carefully about sets of experiences. So, for example, those chaplains can help shape the culture of their organizations by sharing quietly with each other about what they've seen and experienced. That's part one. Part two, human rights abuses are illegal. So there's also that part. I mean, so if you're seeing kind of rampant, awful, terrible abuses, not just like, this is a political question, but like, people are being hurt, people are being killed, people are being subjected to things that are illegal. There's also the obligation, despite the position. So anyway, long story short, I think you are in an ethical conundrum. And the fact that you are doing your best to confront it is beautiful and wonderful. I would take advantage of every opportunity to confront it. I might think about things that I could write publicly that maybe don't name the prison that you're volunteering in or that you're working in directly. That's one way to just sort of bring attention to, that's what researchers do all the time. For example, in my book, I use pseudonyms largely to protect people because some folks are engaged in illegal activity, and I don't want them to be rearrested. I also don't want people to experience shame and further abuse because they shared so much of their lives with me. But another way is to participate in studies. A third way is to talk to journalists off the record to help shape the discourse that happens around and about prison. So when someone from the Marshall Project comes calling, to say there are things I can tell you on the record, but there's some things I can tell you off the record. And while it might not seem helpful, the things that happen off the record give the journalist a warrant to investigate things that perhaps they hadn't thought about. And then they can maybe find someone who can talk more freely with this new knowledge that you've helped give them. That's what I think.
Yeah, thank you for that. Another related question, with the extension of criminalizing people beyond their sentence being very real, how can chaplaincy be extended to continue to walk with those coming out of jail, or how can faith institutions provide support for those leaving the system?
Yeah, this is a wonderful question. I think faith institutions have a real key role in this because of the commitment to hospitality, and so if we could take that seriously, and so we could take that seriously in a few ways. I mean, faith-based organizations, people of faith, can advocate for law and policy change to eliminate the barriers that make it so that people don't have a place. So basically, I argue in the book that we have a social policy of rejection. We have a social policy a set of social policies that we've enacted that are the opposite of our presumed commitment to hospitality and care, to an ethic of hospitality and care. 45,000 laws, policies, and administrative sanctions that prevent people from even having a home, from working, from spending time with their family. And so members of the faith community can bring out these injustices, can bring them to light, can use the literal pulpit, right? Not the bully, the actual pulpit, can use the pulpit, can use their podium to advocate for policy change, and for the embrace and the welcome of the stranger. This is a tenet of all the major faith traditions that I'm aware of. The idea of the welcoming of the stranger, the care for the other, the love of the vulnerable, even the love of the hated. This to me is central to all the faith traditions that I've encountered. And we could take that seriously. One thing that we see faith-based organizations doing are forming councils and ministries and initiatives in regard that target the needs of people coming home. That's very important. But I think that this should happen across all levels. There's the sort of service-based level, but then there's also the important cultural shift. And we as people of faith, our intervention is really in the culture. It's really about how people think and feel about their relationship to the Most High, how they perceive it, what they feel and understand their sense of obligation is to the Most High and to the other, as an expression of that relationship. That's a real place where we can do things. Writing op-eds, writing notes in the newsletter. This all matters. Writing a prisoner. You talked about your pen pal initiative. This is very important, central. This is a lifeline to a man or woman who we've thrown away. And then finally, using our power as a giant community to push policymakers so that our democracy reflects our actual wants and needs as a people. These are the things that I think we must do.
We have time for a few more questions. Can you talk about how privatized prisons has affected mass incarceration?
Thank you for this question. The question of privatization often begins and ends with the private prison, and people will dismiss it by saying that less than 10% of prisons are private. I think that's the wrong answer, honestly. I think when we think about privatization, we have to have a more nuanced thought about this. So I'm really glad that you raised this question. So there's private prisons, about 10%, 9, 8, something like that of the share. But there's also ancillary services in every prison. So everything from what prisoners eat to the notes that they send to the commissary, how they keep the books, the shoes they buy, the clothes they wear, the toiletries that they use, every single service to counseling. All of that stuff is outsourced. All of that stuff is from services that help them to the things that they need to meet their basic human needs. All of that comes from some private entity or another. If you think about counseling services, those are outside agencies that contract with the state, that come in on contracts to provide things for prisoners. I would write and call my brother while he was on the inside. The average cost of a phone call was $6.55 because it wasn't being mitigated through, the phone call wasn't happening through, I wasn't calling the Michigan Department of Corrections. My brother was incarcerated in the state of Michigan. I was calling Securus and JPay. It cost $3 for me to send an email on a holiday if I included a greeting card, because they charged 20 cents a page. They charged 20 cents an image. They charged $1.50 or $1 for the greeting card. The ramen noodles that he eats comes from the commissary, but it also comes from an organization that ran something called Michigan Packages, which suspended its rules around how much you could contribute without them dipping into the money that you gave every month. Anyway, this is the point. And so even counseling sessions were being conducted by members of agencies that got contracts, even reentry programming of different kinds, educational services. Everything is handled through largely private entities inside prisons, and so privatization is quite rampant even in public prisons, and so this is in some cases it's very costly. It costs families. There's a report from the Ella Baker Center called "Who Pays." That chronicles the hard times that people have covering the cost of these things, showing that families are evicted from their homes. They go into financial ruin, trying to cover the needs of their incarcerated loved ones. That comes from the footprint of private entities inside prisons. And I think this is a place where we need real intervention, where it's time for us to rethink what it means for Sodexo or Aramark to be in charge of the food that prisoners eat, rather than, for example, hiring cafeteria workers, state employed people, rather than prisoners, for example, growing their food or something like that. Like there are a million different ways to do the things we've chosen to do, but we've chosen particular ways and third-party partnerships. Public-private collaboration is the main way we've decided to do punishment and do treatment even after we've punished people.
So I have a couple more questions. I'll see if we can get to them all and then we'll conclude. This is from one of our pen pals, I believe. When you get complaints, as I have, about the quality of drinking water in an incarcerated person's cell, how do you get help without exposing the person to retaliation?
It's a very difficult thing. And so what I would do is I would work with a prisoner advocacy group. And so I don't know which ones work with.
We do some of that, actually.
Yeah. That's the way I would do it, because they're going to know how to address, like how to maneuver. I mean, it's tricky, and you need someone with some skills to help you maneuver those things.
Yeah, but basically we don't, it's very, no matter what we may do to protect a person, that there still may be retaliation. And so we always tell people to write to them and make sure they understand that. And if they still want to proceed, that there may be a possibility of retaliation, then we will proceed. Another question Do you find there's a sense of shame and stigma among Black people in talking about family members who are incarcerated? And if so, how do we overcome this?
I think there used to be, and I think there still is to some extent, because we've linked punishment with shame and with guilt, with the presumption that the person has done something wrong that comes from a bad family. I think one way to do this is by telling stories openly, honestly, engaging. One intervention that I'm very happy to see over the last almost a decade now, at least the last 6 or 7 years, has been Sesame Street's Little Kids Big Problems initiative, where they've taken on front and center questions of incarceration and have helped kids wrestle with what it means to have a parent who's locked away. It's these kinds of cultural interventions, from the pulpit, expressing that there's nothing wrong with your family, that we have a problem in this country. We've locked away so many people, and people have made mistakes, but that doesn't have anything to do with you. That you're okay, that we love you, we care for you, we're here to support you, we're not going to judge you. Like the faith community has a real power here to help destigmatize these issues, and I think it needs to use its power to welcome not just the person who's been locked away when they come home, but to welcome the family who's wrestling with the strain of caring for them. And that strain is financial, that strain is emotional, that strain is spiritual. It creates a real crisis, people wondering about their place in the world, about whether or not their sense of the Most High, their God, loves them. And it's important for faith communities to sort of stand in that place with them, to embrace them, to be the arms of the expression of their faith on behalf of those families.
Last question, and I guess this is the big one. How as a culture do we move out of this idea of punishment? I've read about the Danish model, which doesn't rely on punishment, and recidivism rate is minimal.
I think we have to confront it. This is my position. This doesn't mean it's right, but I think we have to confront it forcefully. We have to confront what we've done. We have to see what we've done. I've written about the impact of the 45,000 laws, policies, and sanctions on families, how we've locked people out of the labor market, the economy, how we've made it so that it's nearly impossible for people to make it on their own, and the stigmas associated with that. I think we have to see what we've done. We have to acknowledge it. We have to admit it. We have to tell the truth about ourselves, about our disdain for the other. We have to start somewhere, but it has to be from a place of truth telling, I think. And then once we start from a place of truth telling, we have to start the hard work of imagining something new. And so I've argued that, what we've done is we've made it so that people don't belong. Mass incarceration, from my perspective, is a problem of citizenship, because citizenship is about belonging to a political community, being a fully human participant in a human community, and having a place and a role in society. And through law and policy, we've eroded that. We've made it impossible for people to take a generative part in society because we're afraid of them. And so the challenge that I try to leave us with is to imagine a place for people, even if they've committed and caused us harm. I think that's the place. I think we have to do that important, ethical, moral, spiritual work up front, and also go about changing the laws and policies that do the work of exclusion. So if we think about inclusion instead of exclusion, we might ask, does it exclude or include to have 19,000 labor market regulations? Which ones do we need to maintain this sense of safety that we're really looking for? Which ones do we need? And then what can I do to strengthen the relationships that people who we've locked away have with their loved ones, so that they can thrive when they come home, so they don't turn to crime when they come home? Because what we've done is, through our politics of exclusion, we've reproduced the conditions that that criminologists say cause crime. Unemployment, addictions with no recourse, housing instability, and social ostracization and isolation. These things lead to crime. That's what we say. Well, our laws and policies produce that. And so we have to change how we think, which is exactly what I think faith communities are well poised to help us do. And then go about changing the legal apparatus that produces these things.
Well, I want to thank Professor Miller. It's a wonderful, wonderful interview, and I really appreciate his passion and his mastery of the subject, his sharing his personal life with us. I want to thank Daisy Barner, our intern as well, who's was involved in this program, preparing for this program. The book is called Halfway Home: Race, Punishment, and the Afterlife of Mass Incarceration. The author is Rueben Jonathan Miller. And I want to thank him so much for giving his time to us today, and wish him much success in all his future endeavors. So thank you so much, Professor Miller. And thank you for all who've dialed in, who zoomed in today for this program. The program has been recorded, and we will post it on our website. If you want more information about our Pen Pal program or any of our other programs, I put our website address in the chat, so you can look at that as well if you don't know that. So I want to wish everyone a good rest of the day, a good week, and we have a couple upcoming programs. Stay tuned. In June, we have 2 sessions on restorative justice, the whole process of restorative justice, which definitely doesn't emphasize punishment, but emphasize mediation and people between perpetrators and those who are victims. So look for more. We'll be publicizing that pretty soon. That'll be our major program in June. So again, thank you again. Thank you, Professor Miller.
Thank
I wish
you.
everyone a very good time. Thank you.